Thank you for inviting me to share ideas about how human beings can be aided in their creativity by artificial intelligence. A little background about myself and AI. So, when I was a graduate student long ago in 1970, the first scholarly article on AI in education was published. And the author of that article confidently predicted that by the end of the 1970s, we wouldn't need teachers anymore. Well, obviously, that forecast was not right. Since then, I've lived through 9 hype cycles of AI in education. About every 5 years, people make progress. The optimists declare that we have digital deities. The pessimists declare that the Terminator is coming for us. And all 9 hype cycles, the extremists have been wrong, and they're also wrong in this hype cycle. But significant progress has been made. So, what I bring is a balanced perspective on the strengths and limits of Gen AI and a historic perspective on the evolution of all forms of AI and machine learning over time. So, in this talk, I'll begin by my definition of creativity and why it's important. I want to explain what large language models are and how they work and why people might consider them to be intelligent, what kind of breakthrough we achieved in this hype cycle, and why people tend to overestimate what it can do, and how Gen AI is changing the workplace and what this means for educational outcomes. And all of this context is important for looking at the specific challenges of Gen AI and ethics in terms of creativity and good uses and not so good uses, risky uses of using Gen AI to enhance creativity. So, creativity is a form of knowledge creation. And for me, true creativity is when the knowledge creation is useful. So, um, someone is famous for saying a change in perspective is worth 80 IQ points, which is one way of thinking about creativity. It's a change in perspective that gives you an insight. But insights can be useful or not useful depending on the larger context that you're in. So if you get a great insight about a new form of opening cans in which food are stored, that's a very useful innovation, perhaps, in an area where people eat food from cans. But in areas where the food supply doesn't involve cans, while interesting, it doesn't actually provide an opportunity to be useful. So creativity, in my eyes, as a useful activity, is always shaped by the context within which it's taking place, and it's shaped by the other kinds of things that shape whether knowledge as a whole is useful or not useful. So one of the hats that I wear is that I am the Associate Director for Research of the National AI Institute for Adult Learning and Online Education. The United States has 27 national AI institutes. 5 of them are devoted to education. Ours is the one that's devoted beyond pre-college learning to workforce entry, upskilling, and reskilling. And of course, AI itself is creating a lot of demand for workforce upskilling and reskilling. Uh, the institute that I'm part of has been building different tools, AI-powered assistants for teaching, learning, and social interaction. Those tools are used both by teachers and by learners. So at the front end, it's changing the kinds of learning experiences that people can have. And then at the back end, machine learning is looking at rich sets of analytics, including natural language processing now, and drawing conclusions about what might be useful and feeding those conclusions back not just to teachers and learners, but also to the AI-powered assistants. So it's a different model for how to think about adult teaching and learning. An example of a tool that we have developed that I think can influence creativity is Vera. Vera is a tool that helps students who are learning inquiry, scientific inquiry, or other forms of inquiry by building models. So in an ecosystems class, you might be curious about the role of oxygen in water in the operational behavior of the ecosystem. And you have a simulator that lets you experiment with different levels of oxygen and seeing what the results are. And you're conducting a series of simulations in order to sort out what's happening. This is mirroring what actual ecosystem scientists do in the real world. Vera doesn't do the simulations, and it doesn't tell the students how to do the simulations. But when they are doing the simulations, it provides feedback on the choices that they're making. So the student might change 4 variables in a simulation that followed another simulation, and Vera would say, well, you have a different set of results, but you don't know what to attribute that to because you changed too many things. You need to change only 1 variable at a time if you want to determine what the causal effects might be. So Vera is a counselor that helps students to be more effective and more creative about how they think about using simulation as a way of making meaning out of complexity. And this example is an example of a larger approach to using AI for creativity that I'll describe in more detail later in the talk. So how important is this? Well, it's really important. We are facing a very difficult time in the history of the world, something about which I'll talk more later as well. And you can think of AI as like moonlight. So Shakespeare once said, the moon is a thief. She steals her light from the sun. And that's true. The moon doesn't generate its own light. It reflects light from the sun, and that may be beautiful, but moonlight isn't very powerful as reflected light. It can't drive the water cycle. It can't support photosynthesis. So we need the sun, and the moon is just a byproduct of that. Well, AI's knowledge is like moonlight. It reflects the radiance of human knowledge. It's trained on human knowledge. But what's happening now is that we're feeding back moonlight AI knowledge into the training sets that we're using as if it were equivalent to human knowledge. So we're diluting our knowledge source, our source of light, with AI moonlight, which is a very bad idea. It's going to create a downward spiral in knowledge. So understanding how AI can help with human creativity, how it can strengthen sunlight rather than weakening sunlight is very, very important. And you may say, well, what makes you think that AI is actually diluting knowledge rather than adding knowledge? Well, there's a bunch of very interesting research findings coming out. I don't have time to talk about them today, but the top article describes how the language, the written and oral products that come from large language models is less diverse than the language that comes from humans on a number of important dimensions. You can think of that as being less creative to the extent that creativity involves diverse ways of thinking. There's also evidence that when you use large language models to make judgments, for example, who should go to college and who shouldn't based on their essay, that the large language models tend to favor people in the middle and to reject people at the extremes, as opposed to human beings who are more discriminating and who can see differences that the AI cannot, and can also see the value of things that don't look like everything else. So there are reasons to be concerned about this larger issue of how AI is affecting knowledge. But again, why is this so important? In 2020, I co-edited a book that was about new models for lifelong learning. And in the book, we predicted that the world was entering a period of several decades, so a substantial amount of time, that we're going to be very troubled. And we cited failure to reach any of the 20 UN sustainability goals. We cited climate change. We studied technical advances in many technologies, including biotechnology and immersive learning and AI. And that book was written before the pandemic, before Gen AI, and before the recent change in leadership in the United States that has led to a lot of worldwide disruption in the economy. So, unfortunately, we were very, very right about this issue of difficult decades in which our graduates need to not only have a love of learning, they need to be highly creative, flexible, resilient, have confidence and initiative, have a growth mindset, because they have to thrive on chaos, as a business author in the United States put it. And that both underscores how important creativity is, but it also underscores how important it is to prepare human beings who are capable of doing this, rather than somehow relying on AI to do it. So I've been very controlled about what I've said about the opportunities provided by AI. And that isn't because I don't believe that AI can be highly useful. In fact, I wouldn't be Associate Director for Research of a National AI Institute if I didn't believe that it could be useful. But I would say that 90% of what I read about AI is inaccurate. So the companies are putting out a lot of misinformation for their own purposes. There are well-meaning people who don't know actually how AI works, but who are happy to make forecasts about how wonderful it is, and that creates problems. So let's just pause for a minute to think about large language models and how they generate responses. Chatbots generate responses one word at a time. Now, we may discover alien life in the universe, but I doubt very much that we'll discover any form of biological life that would generate responses in this way. It's not a natural way to think about the production of language. And without trying to explain how that works, and why the responses are appropriate, there's a YouTube video here that can help you to understand that. I will just say that this is not conducive to creativity to generate responses one word at a time. So what does generative AI do well? Well, it solves something called the natural language problem. For 3/4 of a century, people in artificial intelligence have been trying to get to the point where we can talk to the machine the way that we talk to people, not by learning a programming language, not by making a forced choice from 4 options on the screen, none of which reflect what we want to do, not from learning some kind of baby talk language that's highly limited, but just talking. And what large language models can do is they can respond appropriately when they're presented with oral or written input in a language. Now, I'm choosing my words very carefully here. I'm not saying that they understand what they're interacting with or that they comprehend what they're interacting with. They don't. They don't. They're turning these words into mathematical strings and then using the math to generate one word at a time responses. But the responses are appropriate because of how the models do work. And that's a breakthrough because now we can have many kinds of tools where we can interact with those in natural language as an interface. So why is there so much hype about Gen AI being able to do things that we would call artificial general intelligence, AGI? And one way of understanding this is to talk about something else that happened when I was a graduate student. many decades ago. And that is that a Professor Joseph Weizenbaum at MIT, who was an AI researcher and a natural language researcher at that time, developed as a demonstration a little program called ELIZA, named after Eliza Doolittle in My Fair Lady. And ELIZA mimicked a human therapist, a therapist who would echo back to the patient what the patient was saying. So if you were typing to Eliza, you might type, I had a really hard day today. And Eliza would type back, I hear that your day was difficult. And you might type, I hate my boss. My boss is just so challenging. And Eliza would type back, I hear that your boss is part of the problem. And every once in a while, Eliza might type something like, how do you feel about your mother, to make it seem just a little more like therapy. Well, Weizenbaum did this to prove that with no AI at all, with just some tricks with word pattern recognition, he could create a limited kind of dialogue that seemed to comprehend what was being said, even though it didn't understand a single word of the interaction. And he was horrified when thousands of people, including his own secretary, spent hours and hours typing to Eliza, thinking that they were getting therapeutic advice from the program. And what came to be known as the Eliza effect is based on the fact that when we're born, our nervous systems, our brains are wired to listen for language. And if we hear language, then we assume that it's important, that there's intelligence behind it, and we start trying as infants to make sense of that language and to produce that language ourselves. It's perhaps the most complex form of learning that we experience in our entire lives. But when we hear language from an AI that doesn't have understanding and comprehension behind it, the Eliza effect still works. We still take it seriously. We still try to see it as coming from something that's really important and to try to understand the interactions behind it. So the Eliza effect anthropomorphizes AI. It makes AI seem more human and more powerful than it actually is. And that is a definite concern. So what good are these systems given the limitations that I'm describing? Well, they're going to have a profound effect on the world, even with the limits that they have. They're changing what economists call the division of labor, which jobs are done by people, which jobs are done by machines. And if you look at this graphic produced by one of the major consulting firms, I wouldn't pay much attention to the right-hand side because typically these detailed forecasts about exactly what's going to happen are wrong, but I would pay attention to the left-hand side because typically these forecasts are right about the range of professions that are going to be affected by a technology. And this is a very broad range. This is a range that takes many types of work that we did not think that AI was going to affect. And all of a sudden, here we are with Gen AI reshaping work. So how is it reshaping work? Well, intelligence involves complementary roles of judgment and reckoning. And science fiction has long played with how AI might involve this. So Captain Picard is the wise captain of the Starship Enterprise. Data, who looks like a human being, but is actually an android, a machine, an AI, is kind of a partner for Captain Picard, and the two of them together solve a lot of problems with data, assimilating huge amounts of data and making forecasts, and then Captain Picard, with his wise judgment, acting on those forecasts. A less fanciful example is what's happening now with oncology, cancer doctors, because they increasingly have AI partners that can do things no human being can do. The AI can look across the world every morning at 1,500 online medical journals and examine whether there's something new that might help the treatment of this particular patient. It can look online at medical records all across the world of similar patients with similar treatments to see again if there are any insights. And that kind of calculative prediction, reckoning, is very helpful to the cancer doctor. But you would never want the AI talking to the patient because the doctor understands things that no AI can understand. That some people want quality of life and others quantity. That death and pain have profound impacts on human organisms. That there are personal and cultural beliefs about death. That death affects families and treatment options affect families. That there are spiritual beliefs and many spiritual traditions that should be taken into account. All of that is beyond calculative prediction. It's beyond what AI models can do, as we'll talk about more later. So what happens is you get intelligence augmentation, IA, when the person and the AI work together with the AI taking over most of the reckoning and people upskilling so that they can focus newly honed skills on judgment and decision making, including things like creativity, which falls under judgment rather than reckoning. But that only works if people upskill. So I look at the tools that my own institute is building, and these can surround a faculty member and anyone who teaches adults with content tutors, teaching assistants that answer questions, lab assistants, library assistants, assessment assistants, even a social assistant that helps students in a large line class find good learning partners. And if I'm at the center of all those, I can upskill or I can be de-skilled by them. And if I just don't do anything, they take over part of my job. Maybe I have more time to do other things, but the overall effect isn't very positive. But if I upskill and I can learn more about each of my students with that additional time and energy that I'm given, more about their culture, more about their personal strengths and limits, more about their aspirations, I can truly personalize education, then that's IA, that's intelligence augmentation. So it only works if people upskill. How are we doing with that? We're doing very poorly because we tend to measure the effectiveness of our education system by using high-stakes summative tests, the Gaokao, the SAT and ACT, the graduate records exam, law school exams, medical school exams. And those high-stakes summative psychometric tests are reckoning. Without knowing anything about content, the AIs can do quite well on these tests because they involve calculative prediction. So we're training our students to lose to AI in reckoning as opposed to building their capacity in things like creativity and other forms of judgment that can allow them to complement the AI and achieve IA, intelligence augmentation. So that's a really big issue with creativity, is that you can't measure creativity with high-stakes summative psychometric tests. You can measure what people understand about it, but not whether or not they themselves are creative. That needs to be measured through performances. So I don't have time to ask you to turn and talk to other people, but you might look at this list because these are questions for you to reflect on later. How much are we teaching reckoning, and should we be shifting more towards judgment? How much are we preparing students for this very difficult quarter century or half century that we're facing with all of these things going wrong? And can we not only make them good at understanding the knowledge that we have, but in creating new knowledge, new sunlight that can illuminate both human beings and AI? So if you're interested in more about IA, here's an online report that I co-authored that you're welcome to take a look at. If you're interested more in how one teaches judgment, again, something that I don't really have time to get into here, there's another online report that I co-authored that I would urge you to take a look at. So I've been talking about creativity to some extent as individual creativity. You're trying to be creative in understanding an ecosystem. You have different creative hypotheses. You're using a modeling tool to determine which of those hypotheses is actually held up by evidence. And a tool like Vera can help you use the modeling tool appropriately so that you're engaging the full range of hypotheses that you might come up with. But creativity also works by participation in a larger group. Somebody once said that a change in perspective is worth 80 IQ points. And you get that kind of a change being in a diverse group where somebody brings in a completely different example. This is why in higher education, in doctoral work, when we ask people to do a dissertation, we finally ask them at the very end of a long educational process to make a creative contribution to knowledge. We provide a lot of other people that you interact with to try to spur your own creativity on in terms of thinking about what might be possible. And AI can also help creativity as participation. I mentioned 5 national AI institutes. This is one of the other 4 that are pre-college, but they're developing tools that could be used at any level. And one of those tools is designed to help groups of students who are making meaning together. So if you're doing project-based learning, the teacher might have 10 groups of students in the room. Each group is in a different place. How does the teacher know? How does the teacher know which groups are stuck and how to help them out? Well, in this tool, there is a AI that sits in each group. It doesn't participate, but it listens. And it can communicate with the teacher on sort of a dashboard on a portable device the teacher is carrying and say, my group seems to be stuck. Somebody's doing all the talking, or they've been going over the same territory for the last 20 minutes or whatever. And then the teacher, can look at that dashboard and decide which group to go to next and have at least some sense of what's going wrong and try to intervene. That's a tool that could potentially enhance many forms of learning, including creativity in groups. So that's an example of an appropriate use of Gen AI. And again, part of what's happening here is that the teacher and the students have access to a tool that's helping them think. But on the back end, you have sophisticated data mining and learning analytics, including natural language analytics, that help the tool to understand what's going on and how to make it better. Now, this requires an elaborate infrastructure. And in the institute that I'm part of, this is called A for L. And without getting into the technical details, collecting rich examples of language and other things like facial expressions and voice tone and so on, and then processing those and combining them into insights that can be communicated back is pretty complicated. And beyond the tools themselves, we need infrastructures of this type in order to realize this vision of AI that can really help with participatory creativity in particular. Now, this is an example of something called learning engineering, but it isn't about learning engineering as a field. It's about engineering learning, applying engineering processes to learning. And it involves this kind of data analysis. And out of this kind of data analysis can come transformational insights. So the microscope opened up a world of data that human beings did not know existed before the microscope. People didn't know how to collect it. They didn't know how to analyze it. They didn't know what sense to make out of it. But when we developed things like the germ theory, it changed everything. The telescope, the same way, exposes data that we have always been there, but that we couldn't see. And out of that data, when we learn how to analyze it, comes very rich insights. What we're developing now with Gen AI, adding natural language processing and the kinds of infrastructures and tools that these national AI institutes are building, along with many other workers in the field of AI, what we're developing is the equivalent of the microscope and the telescope for learning. And we will, I believe, within the next 10 years, get some profound insights about how people learn and how to accelerate what they're learning, how to achieve IA. And those insights are going to affect things like creativity, knowledge creation that we desperately need to get through this very difficult period in human history. So if you're interested in more about this aspect of it, this more technical aspect of learning engineering, I co-edited a 2019 book on the topic, and then in 2023, a more detailed book, the Learning Engineering Toolkit, came out that really goes into substantial detail about the learning engineering process. And these would be resources that you could look at. Now, one of the things that you'll hear from people in AI is they'll say, well, AI could be your learning partner. Maybe instead of bothering with having all those small groups of students and a teacher going around between them, you should just be sitting at a table, a virtual table, and all the other representatives would be AI agents. And the AI agents could bring the different perspectives, and the AI agents could help you foster your own creativity. And they wouldn't do the weird things that people do. Well, they wouldn't do very interesting things either. I said earlier that there's increasing research that shows that AI represents kind of a middle ground that's antithetical to things like creativity, where you're looking for really extreme perspectives, non-typical perspectives. And so it's a problem to have an AI tool that does that. Fan fiction is an interesting example of this phenomenon of human beings being able to contribute to creativity. One of the other things that I do is I co-host and co-founded a series called Silver Lining for Learning that looks at innovations all across the world. I don't have an opportunity to talk about that now either, but if you're interested, please take a look at the Silver Lining for Learning website. This is describing episode 12. We are now have over 230 episodes, each an hour long, each celebrating a different kind of innovation. And episode 12 was about the ways that even young children contribute to each other's creativity in the context of fan fiction, sites like Hogwarts and Harry Potter. So no chatbot can accomplish the same kind of thing as human beings. And it's a mistake to think that we can substitute moonlight for sunlight. So let me move towards this last section of the talk by trying to describe, again, what AI can and can't do. And what I read predominantly in terms of AI in education is material that assumes that we have artificial general intelligence. That is, that we have intelligence in AI that actually does comprehend and understand what's said to it rather than just responding appropriately. And therefore, that the AI is going to be capable of all sorts of powerful things. I wish that that were true, but it isn't. A large language model is very much like a digital parrot. So parrots can produce language, but it doesn't take long to figure out that the parrot doesn't really understand what you're saying, and the parrot doesn't really understand what it's saying either. And while large language models with the ELIZA effect are more sophisticated than parrots, the underlying mechanism is really still somewhat similar. It's like a brain without a mind. It's like a brain in a vat. So there's no consciousness. There's no understanding that it exists. There's no metacognition, agency, senses, experiences. And this is quite problematic because In creativity, as we began by saying, it's not just having weird ideas, it's having weird ideas that are useful. It's creativity under constraints. And the constraints that are imposed by context and culture and the human world are not understood by AI. So it can't be creative in that way. Um, Even compared to a small child, if you ask an AI questions about eating or having fun with friends on the playground or crossing a busy street, it's not difficult to have the AI produce really stupid and even dangerous answers to these because it's going to give the same answers to any person who types in that prompt anywhere in the world. And that is not a good thing. And you say, well, I can craft the prompt, I can engineer the prompt to do this and that. Well, what you will find is that that engineering doesn't produce very much diversity compared to the diversity that you would get from human beings. AI, in that sense, is like a distorted mirror. People think that AI must be very wise, smarter than any human being, because after all, it's trained on the World Wide Web, and no human being fully understands the World Wide Web. Well, the AI first doesn't understand the World Wide Web, even though it's lurking there inside of its digital neural nets. But the World Wide Web is also a terrible training set because it's not curated. It's full of human biases and misconceptions. It's full of others' intellectual property used without permission. And because of the way that AI works, going back to that earlier YouTube video I referenced, hallucinations are built into AI. It's always going to give you answers, some proportion of which are not true because of the very way that those answers are produced. So when we look at the ethics of creativity and the kinds of ethical problems that can arise from using AI for creativity, it's not just a matter of saying, well, we need to train it on really good data. We need to have a training set that's completely clean, that doesn't have biases and misconceptions. That would help with the data divide. But the data that we have access to is shaped by the access divide, so that there's a lot of data that comes from the privileged and relatively little data that comes from the marginalized. Human beings write the algorithms, and so the algorithms can be biased just because we carry our human biases into that. We interpret the results, and the AI is trained to interpret the results using algorithms. And again, biases and problems can come in at that level. And then there are cultural, economic, and democracy divides that in turn feed back into the access divides. So this whole thing is really a cycle. And that cycle um, has at least 5 different types of attention that need to be paid in order to ensure that we have an AI system that can help us be ethical. And we're not doing well on any of the 5 right now. And almost all the attention is being put on one of the 5, the data divide, which is not a bad thing to work on one of the 5, but it's not sufficient to accomplish what we really want to accomplish in terms of making a difference. So when we sit down in a group or by ourselves with an AI tool that's supposed to help us be creative, it's some of what it provides is going to be ethically troubled because of all of these aspects of the data that shape what the AI is, and the algorithms that shape what the AI is, and the human biases that we carry that the AI may replicate rather than undercutting. Now, an expert in AI might stop me at this point and say, well, Chris, AI is just getting started. We're talking about something that's 2.5 years old. It's a toddler. Give us $1 trillion and give us 10 years, and we'll have artificial general intelligence. Well, I don't believe that. And I'll tell you why. One of the 7 deadly sins of AI is assuming that if something can be performed, that eventually it can be performed well. But the whole history of AI shows us that that's not necessarily true. And for me, an example is dogs that sing. I remember when I first heard that dogs could sing, I was really excited. Wow, dogs can sing. Who knew? Went to YouTube, I listened to dogs singing. It was amazing. But then I realized that dogs don't sing very well by human standards. And you could spend $1 trillion and you could spend 10 years trying to teach dogs to sing well by human standards. And you wouldn't get anywhere because dogs' vocal cords do not have a structure that enables that. And the structure of large language models, one word at a time in mathematical strings that are stochastic and not comprehended, does not lead by any path to artificial general intelligence. I'm not saying that AGI is impossible. I'm not saying that this isn't a step on the path, but it's going to take some other steps, quite different steps, in order to get to AGI. So one of the things I say in every talk that I give about AI and education, we have to remember that in learning, the destination is the journey. So in our work with students, we ask for proxies of learning. At the end of a course, we say, give me an essay or give me a presentation, give me a symphony, give me a sculpture, give me a marketing plan, give me some kind of artifact that is a proxy for your having learned how to produce it. And the students and the teachers focus on the proxies, and the Gen AI can produce the proxies, but the student hasn't taken the journey. So the student hasn't learned how to do it. People say, well, AI, students don't need to learn to write anymore. AI can do the writing. Well, writing is taking your own original ideas, organizing them, finding ways to communicate them to others that are engaging and important, and making a difference in terms of knowledge creation. And AI is just going to produce moonlight knowledge that you're editing, and your own original ideas won't be touched by that. So the idea that somehow AI can take over writing or AI can take over language, students don't need to learn other languages anymore. Languages are ways of thinking. Languages are culture and context shaped. They're not just using different words to say exactly the same thing. We can't afford creatively to throw away languages and say, well, we have Google Translate. So what keeps me up at night is the idea that large language models can be used as a kind of digital duct tape to hold together an obsolete industrial era education system that is not preparing students for this very challenging future, that is not preparing students that are creative, that can participate in knowledge creation, but instead are just preparing teachers to generate lots of AI-driven quizzes, lots of AI-driven lectures, lots of AI-driven podcasts. Doing things better is okay, but doing better things is really the essence of creativity, and we need to be focusing on using AI to do better things. I want to close with something from Greek mythology. Thousands of years ago, the Greek goddess of wisdom, named Athena, always is portrayed with an owl on her shoulder. When the Romans conquered the Greeks, they changed the name of the goddess to Minerva, but they kept the owl. So wisdom involves, at least mythologically, some type of animal sidekick, this owl that helps you to be wise. And I see AI as potentially that kind of a partner for helping us to be wise, to be creative, to use our judgment based on its reckoning, but only if we don't magically think that we can sit on the shoulders of the owl, that somehow the owl is now the dominant person. That's not the case. That's not where we are with AI in education. I hope you found these ideas of interest. I have a professional website that is a repository of lots of resources. I urge you to go take a look at it if you found what I said of interest. And um, I hope the rest of the workshop goes really well. Thank you for asking me to participate.